People in the Middle Ages wore clothes made mostly from simple things. They used fibers that grew nearby or could be traded for. Most clothes were made from wool and linen. These were the most common fabrics. Silk was for the very rich. Hemp was for rougher items. Leather and fur also kept people warm and safe. People made these materials themselves. They did not have factories. It was a lot of hard work. Medieval clothing was made from what was available. Most of Europe grew sheep, so wool was very common. Flax also grew well in many places. Flax gave them linen. These two materials formed the basis of almost everyone's wardrobe. Poor people wore them. Rich people wore them too. The difference was in the quality. Fine wool felt soft. Coarse wool was scratchy. Fine linen was smooth. Rough linen was stiff. Wool kept people warm. It was good for cold weather. Sheep produced wool every year. The farmers would shear their sheep. Then they would clean the wool. They would spin it into yarn. Then they would weave it into cloth. This process took many hands. Many hours went into each piece of fabric. Wool was durable. It lasted a long time. It could be dyed many colors. Wool was a heavy fabric. It was often thick. This helped keep the heat in. It was a practical choice for most people. Linen was different. It came from the flax plant. Flax grew tall and green. Farmers harvested the flax. They processed it in a special way. This process was long and messy, but it made strong fibers. Linen, fabric, felt cool against the skin. It was good for hot weather. People wore linen undergarments. This helped keep their outer clothes cleaner. Linen absorbed sweat well. It dried fast. It was also very strong. Linen did not take dye as well as wool. It was often left in its natural color. This was usually an off-white or beige. It could also be bleached to a pure white. This was a lot of work. Only rich people had truly white linen. Other materials existed, but they were less common. Silk came from far away. It was very expensive. Only nobles and very rich merchants could afford silk. Silk was soft and shiny. It was a status symbol. Hemp was a coarser fiber. It came from the hemp plant. Hemp was used for strong, rough cloth. It was good for work clothes. It made ropes and sacks, too. Hemp was cheaper than linen. It was also easier to grow in some areas, but it was not as comfortable for everyday wear. Leather was another important material. It came from animal hides. Cows, pigs, and sheep provided leather. Leather was used for shoes, belts, and bags. It made sturdy outer garments. Sometimes it was used for armor, too. Fur kept people very warm. It came from animals like rabbits, squirrels, foxes, sometimes even more exotic animals for the very wealthy. Fur lined cloaks. It trimmed garments. It was a sign of wealth and comfort. Most people wore clothes made from local stuff. They did not have big shops. They did not order things from far away. A family might grow their own flax. They might have their own sheep, or they would buy raw materials from a local market. Women often did the spinning and weaving at home. Tailors would cut and sew the fabric. They would turn it into clothes. It was a slow process. Every piece of clothing was valuable. People wore their clothes for a long time. They mended them often. They passed them down. This was a world without fast fashion. Everything was made by hand. It was made with care. The wool was the most important fiber in medieval Europe. It came from sheep. Sheep were common animals. They lived almost everywhere. Different kinds of sheep produced different kinds of wool. Some sheep had coarse wool. This wool was good for rough blankets. It was good for thick outer coats. Other sheep had finer wool. This wool was soft. It was good for clothes worn close to the body. It made finer cloaks too. The quality of wool changed with the sheep breed. It also changed with the climate. Getting wool ready for weaving was a long journey. First, sheep had to be shorn. This meant cutting off their woolly coats. This usually happened in the spring. Shearers used large, sharp metal shears. It was skilled work. They had to be careful not to hurt the sheep. They tried to get the wool off in one big piece. This piece was called a fleece. After shearing, the fleece was dirty. It had dirt, grease, and bits of plants in it. It needed cleaning. Workers washed the wool. They used water. Sometimes they used urine or soapwort. These natural soaps helped clean the wool. They removed the lanolin. Lanolin is the natural grease in wool. Washing made the wool lighter. It made it easier to work with, but some lanolin was left. It helped keep the wool soft. Next, the wool needed to be prepared for spinning. There were two main ways to do this carding or combing. Carding used two flat brushes with wire teeth. Workers pulled the wool between the brushes. This straightened the fibers. It made them fluffy. Carded wool was good for woolen cloth. This cloth was warm and fuzzy. Combing used long metal combs. Workers pulled the fibers through the combs. This removed short fibers. It lined up the long ones in parallel. Combed wool was good for worsted cloth. Worsted cloth was smooth and strong. It was less fuzzy than woolen cloth. Spinning turned the prepared wool into yarn. This was often done by women. They used a drop spindle or a spinning wheel. A drop spindle was a simple tool. It was a stick with a weight. The spinner attached a bit of wool to it. She would twist the spindle. It would spin the fibers together. She would let it drop. It would pull more fibers from the wool. This made a long thread. A spinning wheel made the job faster. It used a foot pedal to turn a wheel. This wheel turned the spindle. It made yarn faster and more evenly. The thickness of the yarn varied. It depended on the spinner's skill. It also depended on what the yarn was for. Thick yarn made heavy cloth. Thin yarn made fine cloth. Once the yarn was ready, it was woven into cloth. This happened on a loom. Looms could be small, for home use. They could be big, for professional weavers. Weaving involved interlacing two sets of threads. One set went up and down. These were called warp threads. The other set went side to side. These were called weft threads. The weaver passed the weft thread over and under the warp threads. This created the fabric. Different patterns of interlacing created different weaves. A plain weave was simple. It made a basic fabric. A twill weave made a diagonal pattern. It was stronger and draped better. Many wool fabrics went through another step called fulling. Fulling made the cloth denser. It made it warmer and more windproof. Workers would wet the cloth. They would beat it. They would sometimes use fuller's earth. This was a type of clay. They might even use human urine. The beating made the wool fibers felt together. It shrunk the fabric. It made it very thick and strong. After fulling, the cloth was often napped. Napping involved brushing the surface. This raised the fibers. It made the cloth softer and more fuzzy. Then it might be shorn again. This trimmed the raised fibers and made the surface smooth and even. Wool was incredibly versatile. It made rough cloaks for peasants. It made fine tunics for lords. It made warm blankets for everyone. It was the backbone of the medieval textile industry. Its warmth, durability, and ability to take dye made it essential. It truly was the king of fibers. Linen was another very important fabric. It came from the flax plant. Flax grew tall and slender. It had pretty blue flowers. Growing flax needed good soil and water. Farmers planted flax seeds. They watched the plants grow. When the plants were ready, they were harvested. This was usually in late summer. Harvesters pulled the whole plant out of the ground. They did not cut it. They wanted the full length of the stem. After harvesting, the flax stems needed processing. This was a complex, smelly job. The first step was retting. Retting broke down the outer stem. It separated the useful fibers. There were two main ways to ret flax. Dew retting meant leaving the flax plants in fields. They got wet from dew and rain. Microbes helped break down the plant matter. This could take weeks. Water reading meant soaking the flax in pools or rivers. This was faster, but it made a very strong smell. It also polluted the water. Retting was crucial. It made the fibers easier to get out. Once the flax was retted, it was dry. Then came scutching. Scutching removed the woody parts of the stem. Workers used a wooden blade. They hit the flax stalks. This broke away the outer bark and inner woody core. It left the long, strong linen fibers. This step needed care. You did not want to damage the valuable fibers. Scutching was dusty work. After scutching, the fibers still had some bits left. They needed heckling. Heckling cleaned and separated the fibers even more. Workers pulled the flax fibers through a series of combs. These combs had sharp metal teeth. The first combs had wide teeth, later combs had finer teeth. This straightened the fibers. It removed any remaining short pieces or tangles. It left long, smooth, lustrous flax fibers. These fibers were ready for spinning. The short fibers that came out during heckling were called tow. Tow was used for coarser cloth. It was used for ropes and padding. Spinning flax into thread was like spinning wool. But flax fibers were long and smooth. They were often spun wet. This helped to make a smoother, stronger thread. Women used a drop spindle or a spinning wheel. Flax thread was very strong. It was not as elastic as wool. It was thinner. It was often finer. This made linen cloth feel smooth. It made it feel cool. Weaving linen happened on a loom. Like wool, different weaves were possible. A plain weave was most common. It made a simple, durable fabric. Linen cloth was dense, it was strong, it lasted a long time. It could withstand many washes. This was important for things worn close to the body. And linen had many benefits. It felt cool in hot weather, it absorbed moisture well. This made it perfect for undergarments. People wore linen shirts and shifts. These soaked up sweat. They kept the outer wool clothes cleaner. Linen also dried quickly. It was not as warm as wool, so it was less common for outer winter wear, but it was essential for summer clothes. It was used for bed sheets, it was used for tablecloths, it was used for many household textiles. The linen fabric did not take dye as easily as wool, so it was often left in its natural color. This was a creamy off-white or light brown. It could be bleached to a pure white. This involved soaking the linen. It involved exposure to sunlight. Sometimes it involved harsh chemicals like lye. Bleaching was a long, laborious process. White linen was a sign of cleanliness and wealth. Only the rich could afford truly white, fine linen. Linen was a common fabric for all classes. Peasants wore coarse linen shirts. Nobles wore fine linen shifts. The quality varied. But the material was always valuable. It was a product of much labor. From plant to cloth, every step needed human effort. Linen was truly an everyday essential. It provided comfort and cleanliness in a tough world. Beyond wool and linen, other materials played smaller but important roles. Silk was the most luxurious, and hemp was more rugged. Leather and fur were essential too. Silk was a symbol of immense wealth. It came from silkworms. These worms ate mulberry leaves. They spun cocoons of fine, strong thread. The process of raising silkworms was called sericulture. It started in China. For centuries, China kept the secret. Silk was traded along the Silk Road. It traveled thousands of miles to reach Europe. This made it very expensive. Eventually, the secret of sericulture reached Europe. It came to places like Byzantium and later Italy, but it remained a specialized, costly industry. Making silk fabric was delicate work. First, the cocoons were heated. This killed the silkworms inside. It also loosened the silk fibers. Then, the fibers were carefully unwound from the cocoons. This produced very long, continuous threads. These threads were then twisted together. This made stronger silk yarn. Silk yarn was incredibly fine. It was strong and had a natural sheen. Silk was woven into fabric on looms. Silk weaving was highly skilled. Elaborate patterns could be created. These patterns often used gold or silver threads. Silk fabric draped beautifully. It felt soft against the skin. It shimmered in the light. It was a clear sign of high status. Only royalty, high nobility, and very rich merchants wore silk. They wore it as outer garments. They wore it for special occasions. It showed off their wealth. It showed their power. Even small amounts of silk were prized. Silk was also used for embroidery. It made decorative elements on other fabrics. Hemp was on the other end of the spectrum. It was a utilitarian fiber. Hemp came from the hemp plant. This plant was easy to grow. It grew quickly, it needed less care than flax. The process of turning hemp into fiber was similar to flax. It involved retting, scutching, and heckling. But hemp fibers were coarser. They were stronger. They were stiffer. Hemp fabric was rough. It was durable. It was not comfortable for clothes worn directly on the skin. So it was used for work clothes. It made rough tunics for laborers. It made smocks for farmers. It was also excellent for ropes. It made sails for ships. It made sacks for carrying goods. And hemp was a cheaper alternative to linen for many purposes. It served a practical role for the common people. It was about strength and cost effectiveness, not about comfort or beauty. Leather was another crucial material. It came from animal hides. Cows, pigs, goats, and sheep provided hides. Getting leather from a hide was called tanning. Tanning prevented the hide from rotting. It made it flexible and strong. Tanners used natural substances. They used tree bark, they used oak galls, these contained tannins. Tanning was a long process. It took many weeks or months. It involved soaking and scraping the hides. It was also a very smelly trade. Leather was used for many things. It made sturdy shoes and boots. It made belts and pouches. It made book bindings. It made armor. Leather offered protection. It offered durability. Yes, it was an essential part of medieval life. People wore leather gloves. They wore leather aprons for work. Leather was very practical. Fur was used for warmth and decoration. It came from many animals. Common furs included rabbit, squirrel, and fox. More expensive furs came from marten, ermine, and sable. Fur was carefully prepared. The hide was tanned with the fur still on. This preserved the hair. Fur was used to line cloaks. It made them very warm. It was used to trim garments. This added a touch of luxury. The type of fur worn often indicated social status. Peasants might wear rabbit fur. Nobles would wear ermine. Fur was a natural insulator. It was vital for staying warm in cold castles and homes. Other, rarer fibers existed. Nettle fabric could be made from stinging nettles, but this was uncommon. It was usually a last resort. Some limited cotton made its way into Europe from the Middle East, but it was extremely rare. It was very expensive. It was mostly seen in very rich households. It was sometimes used as padding. It was sometimes used as an embroidery thread. These niche materials added variety. They added specialized functions. They added status to medieval clothing. Each material had its place. Each required skill and labor to prepare. Each told a story about who wore it. It told where they lived. It told what they did. Clothing was not just about the fiber. It was also about color. Dyes made clothes more interesting. They made them more meaningful. All dyes in the Middle Ages came from natural sources. They came from plants, insects, or minerals. There were no synthetic dyes. Getting good, fast colors was a real challenge. Blue was a very common color. It came from the woad plant. Woad was grown across Europe. Making blue dye from woad was a complex process. Woad leaves were fermented. This broke down compounds. Though it released the blue pigment. The dye bath needed to be alkaline. It needed to be kept warm. Dipping fabric into the woad bath turned it yellowish green. When exposed to air, it turned blue. Repeated dips made deeper blues. Indigo was another blue dye. It came from hotter climates. It was very expensive. It was used for very rich people's clothes. Red was another important color. It came from madder root. Madder grew in many places. The roots were ground up. They were boiled to release the red pigment. Cochineal was a brighter, stronger red. It came from insects. These insects lived on cactus plants. They were found in Central and South America. Cochineal was extremely expensive. It came to Europe after the Age of Exploration. Before that, kermes was used for bright reds. Kermes came from insects that lived on oak trees. It was also very costly. Red dyes were often associated with royalty and high status. Blue yellow came from weld. Weld was a common plant. It gave a good, bright yellow color. Saffron could also make yellow. But saffron was a spice. It was very expensive, so it was not often used for dyeing large amounts of cloth. Or onion skins could also give a duller yellow. Different shades of yellow were common. Green was hard to make well. It often came from over-dyeing blue fabric with yellow dye. So, a blue fabric was dyed yellow. This made green. But getting a stable green was tricky. The colors could fade at different rates. Browns and blacks came from bark, nuts, and iron. Walnut hulls made brown. Oak galls made black. Iron salts could also be used to darken colors. Black was a difficult color to make truly dark and fast. It often looked more like a very dark brown or gray. Only very skilled dyers could make a deep, lasting black. This made good black cloth valuable. Dyeing was not just about the dye. It also needed mordants. Mordants were substances that helped the dye stick to the fabric. They made the color permanent. They made it brighter. Common mordants included alum. Alum was a mineral salt. Iron salts were also used. Wood ash lye could also act as a mordant. Different mordants could change the final color. The same dye plant could give different shades with different mordants. This was part of the dyer's skill. The dyeing process was physical work. It involved big vats. It involved hot liquids. Dye workers dipped the fabric into the dye baths. They stirred it. They checked the color. It took a lot of knowledge. They needed to know about plants. They needed to know about chemicals. They needed to know about heat. Colors had meanings in medieval society. Purple was often reserved for royalty. Red and blue were colors of nobility and wealth. Green was sometimes linked to nature or youth. Black could signify mourning or piety. The brightness and fastness of a color also spoke volumes. Bright, strong colors meant expensive dyes and skilled dyers. Dull, faded colors meant cheaper dyes or less skill. Decoration went beyond just color. Embroidery was a major form of adornment. It used fine threads. These threads were often silk. They could be gold or silver. Embroidery created beautiful patterns. It created images on cloth. It was a sign of skill and luxury. Rich garments often had elaborate embroidery. It showed scenes from the Bible. It showed coats of arms. It showed flowers or animals. Jewels and pearls were sometimes sewn onto clothes. This was for the highest levels of society. Kings and queens wore robes studded with gems. This was not just fashion, it was a display of power. It was a display of wealth. It was a statement. Simple clothes had less decoration. Peasant clothing was mostly plain. It used natural colors or simple dyes, but even a small bit of color or simple embroidery could brighten an outfit. Every element of medieval clothing, from the fiber to the dye, told a story. It told about the wearer. It told about their status. It told about their world.